The laughter was the worst part. Not loud, not mean, just quiet. The kind that passes between people like a secret they all agree to keep. The kind that says we all see it and none of us are going to stop it. Andrew Reyes stood in the marble entrance of the Grand Alderton Hotel, one of the most expensive rooms in all of New York City. He had an invitation in his hand. He had his ID. He had a letter with the foundation's official seal on it. And still, the man in the silver cufflinks was asking him for the third time why exactly he thought he belonged here. Around Andrew, women in gowns that cost more than his rent looked at the floor. Men in suits found something very interesting at the bottom of their champagne glasses. Nobody said a word. Andrew did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not move. He just turned to the man blocking his way and he said 4 words so calmly that the whole room went still. 10 seconds later, the most powerful woman in the building was walking through the door and standing right beside him. But here is the thing nobody knew that night. Not the guests, not the floor manager, not even her. 20 years ago, this quiet man in his one pressed suit had made a choice that saved everything she had. He had paid a price for it that almost destroyed him. And he had never not once, told a single soul. Until tonight. Let's go back to the beginning of that evening. Back to before the laughter, back to when it was still just a father and his daughter, standing in a hotel bathroom on the 42nd floor, trying to get a collar to sit right. Andrew Reyes pressed that suit 3 times this week, Tuesday night after his shift, Thursday morning before the school pickup, and again tonight at 6:15 in the small bathroom of their apartment in Queens with the iron borrowed from the woman next door. The collar still wouldn't lie flat. Was he pressed it a 4th time anyway? That was Andrew, patient, precise, a man who believed that if something mattered, you gave it everything you had, even if everything you had wasn't much. The Grand Alderton Hotel was the kind of place that made you feel small before you even walked in. Crystal chandeliers hung from ceilings so high you had to tilt your head back to see them. The floors were white marble, polished until they looked like frozen water. 500 guests moved through the room in gowns and tailored jackets, laughing the easy laugh of people who had never once wondered whether they belonged somewhere. Andrew didn't belong here. He knew that. He had known it from the moment the invitation arrived in the mail. Crisp, cream-colored, printed with gold letters. He had held it for a long time before he set it down. But Martina did belong here. She had earned every inch of this room. In the lobby bathroom, he straightened the sash across her shoulder one last time and stepped back to look at her. 19 years old, first in their family to go to college, bright and serious and more like her grandfather than she would ever know. "Tonight is yours," he told her. "Not mine, yours." She looked at him the way she always did when she thought he was being too humble. "You built tonight, Papa," she said quietly, "whether they know it or not." He smiled and said nothing. And she didn't know how true that was. No one did. They walked out of the bathroom together and started down the long corridor toward the entrance of the ballroom. Andrew's steps were steady. Then, just for a moment, just one step, they slowed. He already knew what was waiting, and sure enough, at the top of the entrance hall, a man in silver cufflinks turned his head and looked directly at him. Garrett Johnson had worked the event floor of the Grand Alderton for 11 years. He knew this room the way a surgeon knows a scalpel. Every angle, every entrance, every unspoken rule. He knew which guests to greet by name and which ones to simply nod at. He knew how a room breathed, and he knew the moment Andrew Reyes stepped through the door exactly what kind of night this was going to be. He moved forward with a smile already in place. "Good evening, sir. Can I help you find something?" It was a reasonable question, the kind anyone might ask. But Andrew answered it quietly, producing the cream-colored invitation and holding it out with both hands. Garrett looked at it the way you look at something you have already decided is wrong. "And do you have a printed confirmation? We sent digital cards to all registered guests." Andrew explained without any irritation that he had received a paper invitation by mail. He produced his ID. Garrett examined it, then he asked for something else, a secondary form of identification, he said, just to be certain. Andrew reached into his jacket and pulled out the official letter from the Whitmore Foundation, the one with the gold seal at the top and Margaret Whitmore's signature at the bottom. Garrett held it up to the light as if checking for watermarks. By now, people nearby had begun to notice, not all at once. The way attention gathers in a room like that is slow and sideways. A glance over a champagne glass, a whisper behind a hand. The string quartet kept playing. The chandeliers kept glowing. And still, Garrett stood there holding that letter, asking his third question louder than the first two. "Sir, I'm going to need to verify your reason for being here." Martina's nails pressed into her father's sleeve. Andrew felt it. He did not look at her. He breathed in slowly, the way a man breathes when he has made a decision long before this moment, when he decided somewhere quiet and private exactly who he was going to be if this ever happened again. But and then from somewhere just behind Garrett's left shoulder, a voice drifted out of the crowd. Casual, careless. Does he even speak English? A few people looked away, a few others didn't bother. Andrew turned toward the voice, slowly, completely. And then, in a room full of people waiting to see what he would do, he smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an apologetic one, the kind of smile that knows something the room doesn't. The room was still waiting. Andrew let it wait. But he did not hurry. He looked at the person who had spoken. Aaron? Somewhere in the soft blur of silk and cologne, and then he looked back at Garrett, and when he spoke, his English was perfect, measured, precise. The English of a man who had studied it like a second life, because that is exactly what it had been. "The heiress," he said, "is with me." 4 words, quiet as a closed door. For one long second, nobody moved. Then, from across the marble entrance hall, came a sound that cut the silence clean in half. A soft chime, the elevator doors opening. Margaret Whitmore stepped out and paused just long enough to read the room, and she read it fast. The crowd standing at odd angles. The floor manager with a letter still in his hand. The man in the worn suit who was not moving. The young woman beside him, jaw tight, chin up, not allowing herself a single tear in front of any of these people. Margaret crossed the floor without hurrying. That was the thing about her. She never needed to rush. Power moves at its own pace. She stopped in front of Garrett and held out her hand for the letter. He gave it to her. She did not look at it. She already knew what it said. She had signed it herself. "Mr. Johnson." Her voice was level, quiet, the kind of quiet that is louder than shouting. "These are my guests. I'll escort them personally." Garrett's face went the color of the marble beneath his feet. Margaret placed one hand briefly on Martina's shoulder, gentle, unhurried, and then she walked them both past the crowd and into the light of the ballroom. Nobody laughed now. Nobody whispered. The string quartet played on as if nothing had happened, as if the air in the room had not just shifted completely. As they walked, Margaret glanced at the young woman beside her. "What is your name?" "Martina," she said. "Martina Reyes." Margaret nodded. She had read the scholarship files. She knew that name. A strong application, excellent references, a girl who had earned her place here twice over. What she had not yet read was the supplemental essay. On the far side of the ballroom, a woman named Mary Sampson was already moving between the tables, a plain manila folder held against her chest. The expression on her face was not the expression of someone enjoying a gala. It was the expression of someone carrying something heavy and looking for the right place to set it down. But for a little while, it was just a good evening. That is worth saying because good evenings are not small things. Not when they cost 22 years to arrive at. Martina sat among the foundation staff like she had always belonged there, because she had. They asked about her studies. Biochemistry, she told them. Pre-med. She wanted to work in community health in neighborhoods like the one she grew up in, where people put off seeing a doctor until they had no other choice. The woman across from her nodded and said that was exactly the kind of work the foundation existed to support. Martina smiled the smile of someone who is trying very hard not to let the moment overwhelm her. Beside her, Andrew ate carefully. He had watched a video the night before about which fork to use and in what order. He had watched it twice. Ronald Adams, the foundation's board chair, leaned over with the open expression of a man who considered himself good with people. "Oh, and what do you do, Mr. Reyes?" "Mechanic," Andrew said. "Queens." Ronald nodded, the nod of a man quietly reorganizing his assumptions, and said that was wonderful, just wonderful, and then turned back to his salmon. Andrew did not mind. He had spent 22 years around men who nodded like that. He picked up his fork and cut his chicken and watched his daughter explain something about cellular biology to a woman in a green evening gown, and he felt, in that moment, something very close to peace. Then Mary Sampson appeared at Margaret's elbow. She set the folder on the table without a word and leaned down to whisper something close to Margaret's ear. Margaret's hand, already reaching for her wine glass, had stopped in midair. She looked at the folder. She opened it. The room kept glowing. The quartet kept playing. 500 people kept laughing and eating and talking about things that mattered only to them. Margaret read. Oh, her expression moved through polite interest, then a small frown, then nothing at all. Just stillness, the way a pond goes still when something beneath the surface has shifted. She read one line again, then once more. Then she looked up, slowly, carefully. Across the ballroom, Andrew was leaning toward Martina, saying something in Spanish, smiling at whatever she had said back. He had no idea anyone was watching him. Margaret closed the folder, opened it again. Her hand on the table was very still. Mary, she said quietly, is this confirmed? Mary nodded once. The good evening was over. Something else had begun. The folder held Martina's entire application. Grades, teacher references, a personal statement about growing up between two languages and learning to be fluent in both. All of it was exactly what Margaret had expected. Then she turned to the last page, the supplemental essay. The prompt had been simple. Write about the person who shaped your values most. Martina had titled hers in plain letters, no decoration, My Father. Margaret read it the way you read something that starts as one thing and becomes another entirely before you reach the end. Martina had written that she never heard the full story from her father directly. She had pieced it together over years, from a phone call overheard through a thin apartment wall when she was 12, from a single official letter she had found tucked inside a textbook he kept on the highest shelf, and from the way he would go very quiet whenever the name Whitmore appeared on the television news. In 2004, her father had been a bookkeeper at a Manhattan investment firm. He was 21 years old, new to the country, new to the job. Over 6 months, he noticed things in the numbers that didn't add up. Small at first, then not small at all. Falsified valuations. A money moving to accounts it had no reason to reach. A plan carefully built to bleed a major company dry and push it toward collapse. The target was Whitmore Industries. Andrew had reported it, anonymously, to the SEC. Within 30 days, he was terminated. Within 60, his work visa was under review. He spent the next 18 months in a kind of legal wilderness, not deported, not cleared, just waiting. To the way people wait when a system has decided to make things difficult without ever saying so directly. He lost his apartment. He nearly lost everything. He never spoke about it, not to a lawyer, not to a journalist, not even to his daughter. At the bottom of the page, Martina had written in careful, even handwriting. He always said that doing the right thing isn't a transaction. You don't do it for the reward. You do it because you can't live with yourself if you don't. Margaret sat with that sentence for a long moment. Then she turned back to the middle of the essay, to a detail so small Martina had included it almost in passing. A case number cited from the letter she had found on that high shelf. Margaret had seen that number before, once, a long time ago, in a locked drawer in her father's study inside a file he kept separate from everything else. The one he took out every year on the same date, alone. And as if keeping a private anniversary no one had ever asked him to explain, her chair scraped back. Ronald Adams looked up. Mary Sampson reached out a hand that did not quite make contact. Margaret was already moving, past the donor tables, past the string quartet, past the ice sculpture of the foundation's logo melting slowly at the edges, across the full length of the ballroom. Andrew was listening to Martina describe her university dormitory, smiling at something she had just said. And then he looked up and saw Margaret's face coming toward him through the crowd, and something shifted in his eyes. Not fear, not surprise exactly. The look of a man who has carried something alone for 20 years and has just heard for the first time a knock at the door. Margaret did not sit across from him. She pulled out the chair beside him, the one closest to his, and sat down the way you sit when you want someone to understand that what comes next is not an interrogation. Oh, she placed the folder on the table between them, open to the last page. Martina's handwriting, Andrew's story written by his daughter in careful, even letters. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, not quite relief, closer to recognition. The way you look at something you always knew was there, finally stepping into the light. He nodded, and then he told her the parts Martina hadn't known. It had been a Tuesday afternoon. On a column of numbers that didn't balance. He had assumed at first it was his own mistake, and he was new, he was careful, he checked everything twice. He checked it 3 times that day, then again the next morning. By the end of the week, he understood what he was looking at, and he understood that understanding it meant he had a choice. He made the choice. He filed the report, and then he waited for the world to fall on him, which it did, more or less on schedule. The visa review, the termination, the 18 months of letters and hearings and waiting rooms with plastic chairs and fluorescent lights. The night he sat in a laundromat on 43rd Street at 2 in the morning because it was warm and it was open and it was the only place he could afford to be. He had a letter in his hands from Immigration. Inside it was a date, a hearing date, and on the other side of that date, one of 2 lives. His daughter was 8 years old, asleep in the Bronx at a cousin's apartment. As he sat under those lights and he read that letter until he had memorized every word. He told Margaret all of this quietly, without drama, the way you describe something that happened to someone else. Except it hadn't. I never talked about it afterward, he said, because talking about it felt like I was waiting for something, and I hadn't done it for that. He looked at the table. Your father's company employed 4,000 people. I knew what it meant if it went under. That was enough. Margaret was very still. Did you know, she said carefully, whose company it was when you filed the report? Andrew paused, then, yes. And you reported it anyway, knowing what it would cost you. He looked at her directly. I reported it because of that. The string quartet played something soft and slow near the window. Neither of them heard it. Then Andrew set his hands flat on the table and said something else, something about his father. About a hardware shop in Bogota and what it had taken to send Andrew here, and a promise made at an airport gate 22 years ago that Andrew had never once spoken out loud. Margaret looked at him, and she understood for the first time all evening that she was not prepared for what she was about to hear. His father's name was Rodrigo. He had owned a small hardware shop in the La Candelaria neighborhood of Bogota for 30 years. A narrow storefront on a cobblestone street, as with bins of nails sorted by size along one wall and hand tools hanging from wooden pegs along the other. He knew every customer by name. He knew what their houses needed before they did. It was not a large life, Andrew said, but it was a whole one. When Andrew was accepted to an accounting program in New York, Rodrigo did not hesitate. He sold the shop, all of it, the inventory, the lease, the 30 years of goodwill built one customer at a time. And he used the money to pay for Andrew's visa fees, his flight, his first year of rent and tuition. He said to me at the airport, Andrew continued, his voice very even, you go, you build something, you make it mean something. Andrew had carried those words across an ocean and through 22 years and an immigration hearing and a laundromat at 2 in the morning and every day since. Rodrigo Reyes died in 2009, 5 years after the fraud case. Before Andrew's immigration status was finally secured, before anything was rebuilt, before anything was proven, he never saw it. Andrew was quiet for a moment after he said that. Not emotional in any visible way, just quiet, the way a place is quiet after something has been said in it that can't be unsaid. Your father deserved better than what those men tried to do to him, he said finally. And so did mine. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because it is true. And because I have never said it out loud before. Not once. Margaret looked at the table. She thought of her own father, who had survived, who had rebuilt, who had left her an empire and a locked drawer and a file he took out once a year on a specific date, alone, for reasons he never explained to anyone. She looked up slowly. He knew, she said. He knew the report was filed anonymously, but he spent years trying to find out who it was. Andrew went very still. He looked. Every year, Margaret said, until he died. The string quartet played on near the window. Neither of them moved. Then Margaret picked up the folder, set it down, picked it up again. Something happened in her face, a decision forming, solidifying, becoming certain. She did not say it out loud, not yet. She looked toward the podium at the far end of the room. A staff member was adjusting the microphone. 11 minutes until the ceremony began. Said her prepared remarks were in her jacket pockets, so 2 pages, approved, safe, expected. She reached in and touched them once. Then she took her hand away. The room settled the way rooms do before a ceremony. Glasses set down, conversations folded away, 500 people turning in the same direction at the same time. Margaret walked to the podium. Her assistant Adam was waiting at the edge of the stage, the 2 prepared pages held out toward her in both hands. She looked at them. And she thought of her father at his desk, alone, every year on the same date, opening a file he could never close. She thought of a hardware shop on a cobblestone street. She thought of a man pressing a suit jacket 4 times because the collar still wouldn't sit right. She took the pages from Adam, folded them once, handed them back. Then she gripped the edges of the podium and she began to speak. She told them about a bookkeeper, 21 years old, new to the country, new to the job. She told them about a Tuesday afternoon and a column of numbers that didn't add up, and a choice made in a moment when walking away would have cost him nothing. She told them about the report, the termination, the 18 months of waiting in rooms with plastic chairs. She told them about a laundromat on 43rd Street at 2 in the morning, and a letter, and a little girl asleep in the Bronx who would never know any of it happened. She told them about a hardware shop in Bogota, sold piece by piece so a son could cross an ocean. She told them about her own father, about a locked drawer, about a case number reviewed in private every year like a prayer with no one to address it to. Her voice did not waver once. It was level and clear and precise. And that steadiness, that complete refusal to perform was what undid the room. People who had spent the evening discussing investment portfolios sat with tears they were trying to decide whether to acknowledge. And then Margaret looked up. Effective immediately, she said. The Whitmore Foundation's Young Leaders Scholarship will be renamed. It will be called the Rodrigo Reyes Award for Moral Courage. She let that sit for a moment. Then she turned her head, slowly, deliberately, toward the back wall of the ballroom, where Garrett Johnson was standing very still near the service entrance. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Mr. Johnson, I'd like to discuss your conduct this evening at your earliest convenience. As of tonight, the foundation is reconsidering all vendor contracts with this property. Garrett Johnson walked out before the applause began, and the applause did begin. It started at a single table near the center of the room, a young woman on her feet, her hands coming together hard and certain, and it moved outward from there like a wave finding the shore. But the camera of this story does not stay at the podium. It finds Andrew. He is not watching Margaret. He is not watching the crowd. He is looking down at the table, at his hands, at the worn cuffs of his jacket. His shoulders are very still, his jaw is set, and his eyes, just for a moment, just briefly, are full. He cries the way a man cries who has spent a lifetime making sure no one sees it. Quickly, quietly, without a sound. But the Martina reaches across the table and takes his hand in both of hers. He lets her. From the podium, through the rising sound of 500 people on their feet, Margaret's voice carries one last time across the room. And now, it is my honor to call to the stage this year's inaugural recipient of the Rodrigo Reyes Award for Moral Courage. She paused. Martina Reyes. Martina walked to the stage the way her father had walked into this building. Without hurry, without apology, with everything she needed already inside her. The room was on its feet, all of it, 500 people who an hour ago had been talking about acquisitions and tax structures, now stood with their hands together for a 19-year-old girl from Queens who wanted to be a doctor in the neighborhood she grew up in. She reached the podium. She looked out at the crowd, the donors, the press, the board members, the chandeliers, and she did not speak for a long moment. And she was looking for something, then she found it. Her father, standing at the back of the room near the window where the city spread out behind him like a second sky. My father taught me, Martina said, her voice clear and steady and entirely her own, that dignity is not something a room gives you. You bring it in with you, even when someone tries to take it at the door. Andrew could not find his voice. He did not need to. On his face said everything a voice could not. The particular expression of a man who has arrived finally exactly where he always believed he should be, and is only now allowing himself to know it. The applause that followed was the loudest of the evening. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the waitstaff had begun collecting glasses and the chandeliers had been dimmed to something quieter, Margaret found him standing alone by the window. But she stood beside him and looked out at the city below, on the lights going on and off in 1,000 buildings, 1,000 lives at their windows, none of them knowing what had happened in this room tonight. She told him the foundation would be in touch, that there were things to make right, formally, legally, on the record. Andrew listened, then he shook his head, not in refusal, but the way you shake your head when you are finally putting something down after carrying it for a very long time. "Well, just treat the next one right," he said. "That's enough." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I've been writing checks into the dark," she said. "I didn't know who was on the other side." Andrew looked at her. "Now you do." Outside on a street below that neither of them could see, a journalist named Michelle Cross uploaded a video to her phone. By morning, it would be seen by 4 million people. By the end of the week, 22 million. With the line that traveled furthest, shared in 43 countries, translated into 17 languages, printed on cards and sent to strangers. And it was not about the billionaire. It was not about the gala. It was 11 words spoken by a 19-year-old girl who had learned them from a man who never once asked for credit. Dignity is not something a room gives you. You bring it in with you. And 50 floors below the Grand Alderton Hotel, the city that Rodrigo Reyes sold everything to send his son to, kept moving, the way cities do, without ceremony, without pause, indifferent to the lives being quietly, permanently changed inside its towers. Andrew stayed at the window a little longer, not waiting for anything, not performing anything. Simply here, simply arrived. In the La Candelaria neighborhood of Bogota, on a cobblestone street that still remembers the weight of bins full of nails sorted by size, there is a coffee shop where a hardware store used to be. The new owners kept the sign above the door when they moved in. Nobody told them to. It just seemed right. The sign reads Reyes. It turned out to be the right name after all.